This lecture is an introduction to genes and the study of genetics. So, our genetic material is the information that tells our cells what they need to do. And it basically determines a lot of the physical characteristics of people. This genetic material is stored in the DNA inside the nucleus of our cells. Our DNA consists of two strands. You've probably seen images like the one on the left here that kind of show you that twisted shape of the DNA. On the right, we've got one little area circled that's labeled nucleotide. DNA consists of a series of these nucleotides. Each nucleotide contains a sugar, a phosphate. Those form the sides or backbone of the DNA, and then they include a base, and that base connects the two strands of DNA. Our nucleotides or bases are adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. We have these four different types of nucleotides. And the order of these nucleotides is the genetic code. You can think of them like letters. The DNA stays in the cell's nucleus. So the information has to get out of the nucleus. What happens? It gets copied into a structure called RNA. I know DNA and RNA sound very similar, and they are similar. There's a lot of similarity between these two, but there are a few differences as well. One of which is that the RNA carries the information, it copies the information from the DNA and carries it out of the nucleus. Most of the time it goes to structures called ribosomes that are on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So we had a discussion about cell theory previously. Remember, the rough endoplasmic reticulum with those ribosomes is the location where proteins are manufactured. And in fact, the information in the DNA codes or gives instructions for how to manufacture these proteins. Each gene will give you information on how to make a specific protein. Proteins then do the work of the cell. So what about things like carbohydrates and lipids? We need those in our cells too. Well, those are manufactured by proteins. So the instructions to make a carbohydrate will be actually instructions for making the proteins that then manufacture the carbohydrate. So a gene is the information, it's the instructions for making a protein. These are the recipes of the cell. Now, not all of the DNA consists of genes. There's a lot of other stuff going on in the DNA. It has lots of different important functions that help things like regulate when a gene is copied into RNA, or to help hold the structure together, or to reduce degradation or breakdown of the chromosomes or the strands of DNA. But the genes are the information, the instructions. Now, there can be a lot of different variations on genes. Well, we call these variations alleles. So the gene that manufactures hammers is always going to manufacture a hammer, but if there are different alleles of it, it might make a tack hammer or a framing hammer or a claw hammer, all of these different kinds of hammers. We can also think of these as recipes, and there are lots of different recipes to make pasta sauce or chocolate chip cookies. This variation is what makes us genetically unique. And every person on the planet is genetically unique. Yes, even identical twins, because by the time they're born, one of them's going to have a genetic mutation, a change in the DNA information. When we think of being genetically unique and this variation in genes, we think of things like hair color and eye color and height. But there are a lot of less obvious things as well. There's blood type. There's how you taste food. Myself, I think I'm what's called a bitter super taster. Things that are bitter are just very, very strong to me. So I like a mild roast coffee. It probably tastes pretty similar to what other people taste when they taste dark roast. One of the things we talk about when we talk about genes are mutations. A mutation is a change in the gene. And it can be very small. One of those nucleotides can change. If it's a single nucleotide change, like the one on the left, most of them, yeah, we're not ever going to notice those. If your liver gets a mutation in one of the genes that controls eye color, so what? It's not going to affect you at all. Some mutations won't change the proteins that are being made or how much of them is being made. No issue at all. This is true for the single nucleotide mutations most of all. Some of them will have an effect. If it has an effect, it's most likely going to be harmful. But it has to be in a gene that's important for that cell type. It can also be benign. It's a change, but it doesn't really harm or benefit you. Or it can be beneficial and give you some kind of advantage. So a lot of athletes might have genetic mutations that help them extract oxygen from their lungs better, or store more ATP in their muscles for when they're exerting themselves energetically. ATP, of course, is the energy of the cell. Now we also have bigger types of mutations. Those are shown on the right. We'll talk about those more in a future lecture, but you can have these huge mutations where a whole section of your DNA is deleted or duplicated, and now there's twice as many of those genes. Or it's turned upside down, which actually can be a significant problem. Swapped from one strand of DNA to another. All kinds of things that can happen. So that's the rough idea of genes. But what is genetics? Genetics is the study of biological heredity, how biological traits are passed from one generation to the next. Now, traits are affected by both your genes and your environment. Some traits have what we call low heritability. There's not much in the genes that affect what language you learn to speak as a child, how you like to dress, if you're religious, and if so, what is your religion? Those are more shaped by the environment. Some things have very high heritability. Your blood type, it's coded in your genes. The environment you grow up in is not going to change your blood type. Eye color, not going to change. Okay, there are a few exceptions to this rule, but as a general rule, your eye color doesn't change during your life. If your eye color suddenly changes, go see a doctor. Then there are the things that have what's called medium heritability. And this can be a combination of your genes and your environment. One of the most obvious ones is weight. There's some impact of your genes on your body weight, but there's also some impact of the environment. If you can't get outside for half the year because you live in New England and can't stand the cold, that's going to have an impact on your weight. Your height is also influenced by both your genes and the environment. Specifically, how much nutrition you got as a kid. So, the environment, one of the ways it influences traits or characteristics is by influencing something called gene expression. Expression is our fancy word for saying, is this gene being used in this cell? And if so, how much protein is being made from it? My favorite one of this is, do you notice the first cold day of winter and it seems really, really cold? But at the same temperature in February, maybe you don't need your parka? You need a lighter jacket. It doesn't feel as cold to you. That is a change in your gene expression. Genes can also make you predisposed or more likely to get a particular health problem. Heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes. You might have genetic characteristics that make you more likely to get these than other people. These are all conditions that seem to run in families, but it's not a simple one gene changes, therefore you have type 2 diabetes. There's environmental factors as well. So type 2 diabetes, if you've got a genetic predisposition and you eat a lot of meat and become obese, well, there you go. You're much, much more likely to get type 2 diabetes. But if you don't have that genetic mutation and you eat a lot of meat and you're obese, you might not get type 2 diabetes. And of course, cancer, if you're genetically predisposed to it and you smoke, there you go. But there are some people who smoke all their lives and never get it. They've got different genes or different alleles, different versions of the gene. When we talk about genetics and genetic inheritance, we need to talk about how this is passed on from parent to offspring. So in humans, our genetic material is organized into 23 pairs of chromosomes. So an individual chromosome is one of those double-stranded, double helix, those two strands of DNA that are wrapped around each other. That's a single chromosome. And we have 2 copies of each. And they're all different sizes. So we have names for them, but I mean numbers really. The largest chromosome in any organism is always going to be number 1. The 4th largest chromosome is always going to be number 4. The 12th largest chromosome is always going to be number 12. And each pair of chromosomes are going to have the same genes in the same locations. They can have different alleles, but they're going to have the same genes. So chromosome 9 has the genes that determine your blood type, or the gene that determines your blood type. And there are 3 possible alleles: type A, type B, or type O. You may or may not be familiar with blood types. Most people have A, AB, B, or O. And the combination of the alleles on chromosome 9 determine your blood type. Since you have 2 copies of each chromosome, you have 2 copies of each gene. With the blood type, if you have one gene that has the allele for type A blood, and your other copy has the allele for type B blood, you're going to have type AB blood. We inherit one copy of each chromosome from our mother and the other copy from the father. There's this process called meiosis, where the cell, the precursor cell, divides in a special way that they go from having 2 copies of the chromosome, go through this whole process and become either sperm or egg that only have 1 copy of each chromosome. And then when fertilization happens, those 2 different copies of the chromosome end up in your cells. That's the rough overview of genes and genetics.